Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are continuing our reading of Silas Hocking's Real Grit. We are progressing very well in the story so far, and events have continued to transpire that surprise all the characters in the book. In fact, poor Ada believed that she had seen a ghost, a figure that resembled one that she had known all too well, Jack Formby, the son of Robert Formby, who has disappeared and is presumed dead after his disgrace with Brown Toadsby's financial office in Bodleford. Where it is that Jack is, and what he has been doing in all this long time, is still a mystery, but one, I think, which is about to be revealed to us. And so, without further ado, let us jump right in to Real Grit, with Chapter 22, Gaining Experience. It is now time that we returned to the hero of this story, for none of our readers will have imagined for a moment that Jack Formby was really dead, or even that a serious misfortune had befallen him. I'm very glad to hear that. In truth, he had, single-handed and alone, been fighting the world during all these months of silence, and displaying in a marked degree the stuff of which he was made. After his midnight ramble on the banks of the Bodle, to which allusion has been made, he came back to his lodgings, nerved and strengthened for the conflict that lay before him. He had tried, during that long and lonely walk, to look all the issues fairly in the face, to gauge his own strength, and to calculate the chances of success. And instead of giving up in despair, he returned to his lodgings with a lighter heart than he had known for many a day. "I fancy I'm a strange contradiction," he said to himself, "but there is something positively inspiring in the thought of fighting fate and fortune, single-handed with the hope of winning victory. No favour from anyone henceforth, no assistance from relative or friend, no adventitious aid of any kind. Nothing but the strength of my own heart and arm, coupled with the inspiration of a strong, pure love and an honest purpose. God help me, and I'll be a man." He spent the next day in straightening his affairs, as he termed it. A few trinkets he had kept by him for the sake of old times he converted into money. One change of raiment he packed into a carpet-bag, and leaving the rest to pay for his lodgings, he felt he was ready for the start. The following day being Sunday, he took a long ramble into the country, as was his usual custom when the weather was fine, and got back again in time for the evening service. "I've been to no place of worship today," he said, after he had finished his frugal tea. "I think I'll drop into the little chapel in the next street." And, suiting the action to the word, he donned his hat and sauntered forth. The service was a very simple one. For that reason, perhaps, it suited his mood. The preacher was a young layman and evidently new to his work. Yet there was one sentence in the sermon Jack never forgot, and which made the service to him one of the most profitable he had ever attended. The sentence was not the preacher's own, but was a quotation from the public utterances of some great man who had recently died, and was as follows: "The best thing that can happen to most men is to be thrown overboard, and compelled to sink or swim for themselves. In all my experience, I have never known a man to be drowned that was worth saving." "That's me," Jack said to himself. "I'm thrown overboard, heaven knows, and if I'm drowned, it is because I'm not worth saving. Well, we shall see. I'll not be drowned if I know it. So now for the long swim." He heard no more of the sermon. That one sentence stuck to him like a burr, and rang its changes in the chamber of his memory through all the evening, and mingled with his dreams in the silence of the night. Early next morning he started for Liverpool. "I shall sink if I stay in Bodelford," he said to himself. "That's a dead certainty. In Liverpool I shall be lost, and take my chance in the crowd. I may be able to keep afloat. At least I shall try." He had no idea what he should do, or even attempt when he got there. He was prepared to undertake anything in reason that might turn up. He was prepared to begin at the very bottom. His position had all the novelty and charm of an experiment. He was going to prove for himself whether a man without means or friends had any chance in the world, or any hope of making an honest living. He discovered, a few weeks later, when his money was all spent, that it was not simply means and friends that he lacked, but ability. For every situation there were 100 applicants, and every one of them far better fitted for the post than he. He had heard a great deal about unskilled labour, but somehow none of it seemed to come in his way. Down at the docks he saw hundreds of men at work, loading and unloading vessels, but their labour appeared to him anything but unskilled. Everywhere men were busy: sailors, plumbers, joiners, masons, bricklayers, road-makers, teamsters, all absorbed in their own occupations, and all working after a fashion that proved that they were trained men, and had prepared themselves for their various offices by long years of practice. "It seems to me that I can do nothing," he said to himself, after tramping from place to place, and trying in vain to earn an honest penny. "I might take a clerkship, but 100 better men are in before me, and what else is there open to me? I cannot serve behind a counter, or even repair the streets. I cannot sweep a chimney, or build a wall, or roof a house, or whiten a ceiling. I couldn't even drive a cab or an omnibus, though I know something about horses. Surely there must be something wrong in our education," he reflected. "A Jewish lad, I have been told, was always taught a trade, whether he belonged to the rich or the poor. Surely the old Jews are wiser in their day and generation than we are. If I had only learned a trade instead of learning Greek and Latin, how much better it would have been for me. Now I starve in the midst of plenty, and remain idle when I would gladly work, just because I have never learned to do anything. And now there is nothing that I can do." Jack's courage began to slowly ooze away, when absolute want stared him in the face. It had been a great trial to him to come down to a 3-penny bed at a model lodging-house, but a greater trial still when even that shelter was denied to him. From 3 meals a day he had been reduced to 2, and from 2 to 1, and now he found himself without even the means of getting that. He had honestly tried his best, but so far he had failed. He was willing to do anything, however menial, so long as it was honest, but there was no room for him. Evidently, he was not wanted. He had never begged yet, and he felt that he would rather die than ask alms of anyone. In some of the low lodging-houses where he had found a night's shelter, he had been compelled to mix with thieves and vagabonds, had listened to their conversation, and had been an unwilling witness to some of their imprudent and infamous tricks. He had seen them empty their pockets upon the table, stretch out their supposed deformed and withered limbs, remove the lumps from between their shoulders, and boast that there was no more paying perfection going than the artful dodger. But their ill-gotten gains had never been any temptation to him. "If I can't live honestly, I'll die," was his constant reflection, and as there seemed no chance of the former, death began to loom before him as the one and only alternative. To make matters worse, the weather became all at once rainy and cold. To sleep in the open air when the nights were warm was bearable, but to shiver under a railway bridge with a biting wind whistling through was scarcely less terrible than death itself. "I never thought I should come to this," Jack said to himself one chilly night, as, drenched with rain and almost famished, he crept into an empty cask down by the docks. His carpet-bag and change of raiment had all been pawned and the money spent in food, and this day he had not earned a penny, nor tasted food since morning. "I fear my philosophy is failing me," he said to himself. "It's all very well to talk about a tide in the affairs of all men. If it's true in my case, it is an ebb tide. I've been fancying every day for the last month that I had reached the bottom, and every day I found a lower deep. One thing, however, is certain. I'm nearer the bottom than when I left Bodelford." The shelter was a very poor one. Still, it was better than being out in the rain and wind, and he tried to make the best of it. He could hear the splashing rain as he lay coiled up in the darkness, mingling with the sighing of the wind and the beating of the waves against the river wall. But there was no message of hope in any sound that fell upon his ear. It seemed to him that he was utterly forsaken of both God and man. All the day, and for many a day, he had tried to keep a brave heart, to put a bold face on the matter. But hope had nearly failed him now, and the tears came unbidden to his eyes and rolled silently down his cheeks. He tried to pray, but somehow the words would not come to his lips tonight. He had prayed so often and had received no answer that he had nearly lost all faith in prayer. He could only lie still and listen to the surging wind and beating rain, and wonder what the end would be. Sometimes, in moments of fitful slumber, he fancied himself back again in Rycroft, and the surging waters of the rising tide was the singing of the Bodle River, and the splashing rain and rushing wind became the music of summer breezes in the tall trees about his home. And for a little while, happy smiles would play about his pinched and pallid lips. Then, with a start, he would reach out his hand in the darkness, and tears would begin to fall again. As the hour of midnight drew near, the wind rose almost to a gale, and the cold became unbearable. Jack shuddered as the biting gusts swept past, tried to crouch further back in the cask, but he was almost too weak to move, and with every effort his head swam, and consciousness threatened to leave him altogether. I wonder what Ada would think if she saw me now, he said to himself. I wonder if she ever thinks of me, or if she has forgotten me altogether. No, I do not think she can forget me quite. She loved me once. I'm sure she did. She let me kiss her without rebuke, and told me that I might live in hope. She will think of me sometimes, though she will never know my fate. It is best that she should not know, for the knowledge would give her pain. Oh, Ada, my love, my life, perhaps we shall meet in a better world than this. And the poor fellow gave way to a great burst of weeping, while the sobs shook his very heart. In the midst of these sad reflections, a heavy footstep startled him, and the next moment the glaring light of a bull's-eye lantern was flashed upon him, while a stern voice bawled out, "So you're here, are you? Come clear out at once, and duck it, or I'll run you in." "I'm doing no harm," Jack said feebly, "and I've no place else to go." "No place else, eh? We'll soon see about that, if you don't clear out." "You might let me stay," said Jack. "I can't tramp the streets on a night like this. Besides, I've no strength left." "You're an old one, evidently," said the policeman with a coarse laugh. "But come, dry up and clear out at once." "I wish you'd let me stay," Jack replied in a feeble voice. And before I turn this next page, I will show you the print there, as Jack is met by the policeman with the flashing of his bull's-eye lantern. Those are a particular type of hooded lantern that you may have been able to see in the picture. They're small and single-directional, so they produce a spotlight, I guess like the flashing of a mad bull's eye as it leers in your direction, though I'm not sure exactly where the name comes from. I cannot be doing any harm here, and if you have a spark of human feeling, you will not deprive me of this poor shelter on such a night as this." "Don't talk to me about feeling," said the policeman. "I know my duty, and I'm a-going to do it. Will you come out?" "The fact is, I'm too weak to try," was the answer. "I really have no strength left." "Any road, you'll rue it," said the policeman, and he blew his whistle, and in a few moments was joined by a brother officer. There was no more parleying after that. Jack felt himself suddenly and rudely dragged out of his shelter, and with a burly form on either side, was marched, almost carried, to the police station. At one time he would have shuddered at the bare idea of such a place, but he had suffered so much of late that a prison cell had no longer any terror for him. On the contrary, he welcomed its grateful warmth and shelter, and stretched himself on the wooden couch with a sigh of relief, and was soon locked in the arms of kindly sleep. Chapter 23. Gentleman Jack. Pale, haggard, and badly dressed as Jack Formby was when he stood before the magistrates on the following Monday morning, nothing could hide from them the fact that he was a gentleman. In a very few words, the chief of police charged him under the Vagrancy Act with sleeping out of doors and with loitering about in a suspicious manner without having any visible means of subsistence. To 2 of these counts Jack pleaded guilty, but denied that there had ever been anything suspicious in his actions. His few and well-chosen words evidently impressed the magistrates, and he was requested to defend or explain his conduct. "In truth," Jack said, "I have no defence. It is quite true I was discovered in an empty cask, and that I have no means of subsistence. If this be a crime, gentlemen, then I am guilty, and must suffer the penalty. If it be a crime to suffer hunger, to be famished for a crust of bread, if it be a crime to be repulsed at every attempt you make to earn an honest penny, and to wander through the streets, friendless and alone, then, gentlemen, I am a criminal, and have nothing further to say." "But how came you to be in this plight?" asked one of the magistrates. "You are evidently an educated man, and it certainly looks suspicious to see you in this condition, to say the least." "Perhaps that is so," said Jack, "and yet, were I to explain, the chances are that you would not credit my story." "But what is your story?" asked the presiding magistrate. "Just this, that my father was accounted rich. Indeed, he was rich, as you would know were I to tell you his name, but through heavy speculations in futures he lost all he had, and died a bankrupt in April last. I was left absolutely penniless, and having no trade in my fingers, I have tried in vain to earn a respectable living. I came to your city partly to hide myself from those who knew me in my prosperity. I have honestly tried to get a living. Hitherto I have failed. For the last 3 weeks I have had to content myself with 1 meal a day, and frequently I have had to sleep out of doors or tramp the streets all the night. I am willing to do work, to do any trudgery, if I may but earn my bread. If I cannot find work, I must starve and die." And Jack pushed his fingers through his curling locks, an old habit of his, then quietly folded his arms and waited the result. After a very brief consultation, the case was dismissed, and Jack was requested to call at a certain office at 3 o'clock that afternoon, when he would probably hear something to his advantage. The upshot of this adventure was that Jack was offered the position of stable boy by one of the bus proprietors of the city, and without any delay entered upon his duties. 12 shillings a week for a start could not be considered a princely sum, especially when he had to work 12 hours a day. But still, it was enough to keep him from starving, while it had in it the promise of something better for the future, if he could only patiently bide his time. Hence, Jack entered on his work with a light heart, determined that he would do his best, and hopeful that there would be no more ebb in the tide of his fortune, and that henceforth there would be an unceasing flow. The work proved quite as congenial as he had anticipated. He was fond of horses, and in the old days had rather prided himself on being a good groom, and now that his living, and even his hope of the future, depended on the manner in which he discharged his duty, he threw himself into his work with a will, and gave abundant satisfaction to all concerned. He soon became a general favourite with his mates, who nicknamed him Gentleman Jack, and who treated him with the respect they considered due to his superior position and education. He was always very reticent about the past, taking no one into his confidence, and giving no hint of having known better days. But the story he had told before the magistrates could not be kept a secret, and in a very short time there was not an employee of the Liver Bus Company that did not know something of his story, and was quite prepared to believe that this pleasant, athletic groom was the son of some earl or duke, if not an actual prince in disguise. Jack had no idea that he was the object of so much interest, or so frequently the subject of conversation. He threw all his energies into his work, and made it his chief concern to mind his own business, and not to meddle with other people's. Hence, very little of the gossip came to his ears, and very few of his mates had the courage to question him respecting his past life. When anyone did so, he gained but little by his inquisitiveness, for the subject was too sacred to Jack to be made the gossip of stable boys. Yet notwithstanding his reticence, he always met their questions so pleasantly that they were never offended. So Gentleman Jack remained a mystery, an object of pleasurable curiosity, but always a comrade in whom the others could implicitly trust. At the end of 2 months, one of the productors having fallen ill, Jack was promoted pro tem to that position, with a salary of 18 shillings a week. This was such a marked advance that he felt quite rich, and was able to purchase a few things that he had long stood in need of, besides lay a shilling aside or two every week against a rainy day. But the work was less congenial to his taste than was that of stable boy. The eternal rattle and jostle of the bus, up and down the same streets 10 or a dozen times a day and 7 days a week, became irksome and monotonous in the extreme. Other people might have half holidays now and then, and a day of rest once a week, but for drivers and conductors there was no such privilege. From Monday morning to Monday morning, every day was alike, except that they did not start quite so early on the Sunday. Religious people going or returning from their places of worship snarled at him if he was a little late, or if he failed to stop at the right crossing. He was expected to see every old woman that frantically waved her gingham at a street corner, and every dainty miss that held up her gloved hand in the crowd. He must have consideration for everyone, must be polite and respectful, whatever his annoyance. But no one seemed to have any respect for him. He had neither a heart to feel nor a soul to be saved. He required neither Sabbath nor sanctuary. Horses, driver, and conductor were placed on the same level, except that the horses were a little less hardly worked than they, and sometimes better housed and fed. Religious people prayed for the heathen abroad, and prated piously about the sacredness of the Christian Sabbath, and kept landlords and barmaids at home to supply them with their Sunday beer, and demanded drivers and conductors to be on the route, to take them to and from their devotions. Jack grew utterly sick of the work after a few weeks, yet he made no complaint, and gave no cause for any. He had his living to get, and so likes and dislikes were not to be considered. He reflected that he was no worse off than thousands of others. Indeed, there were thousands who would gladly have exchanged places with him. The work might be a little more tedious to him than to some others, because he had had a different upbringing. For that reason, he must stick more resolutely to his duty until he had become thoroughly inured to the life. Christmas came and went, but for him there was no angel's song or message of hope, no Christmas card or love token of any kind. He was quite alone in the world, and for all he knew, forgotten. He heard groups of children singing in the streets, "Christ was born in Bethlehem." But the song awoke no thrill of joy in his heart. It seemed as if it were not for such as he that the Saviour came. And when from numberless sanctuaries there floated out on Christmas morn the well-known hymn, "Christians awake, salute the happy morn, whereon the Saviour of mankind was born," it did not seem that that call was for him. He felt as though he were a heathen in a Christian land, an outcast from the Father's home. For 4 long months he had never crossed the threshold of church or chapel, and no one treated him as though he had a soul. How long he might have remained in the employ of the Liver Bus Company, it is impossible to say, had not an accident soon after Christmas liberated him from his bondage. The bus was at a standstill, and he was standing on his little round perch, holding tightly the leathern strap by which he steadied himself when the vehicle was in motion. Along a narrow street, a corpulent old lady was hurrying with all possible speed, and for whom all without and within the bus were impatiently waiting, when the horses gave a sudden start, snapping in twain the strap Jack was holding and precipitating him, head foremost, into the street. He was picked up insensible and taken at once to the hospital, where it was found that, besides a slight concussion of the brain, he had sustained a fracture of the collarbone. Nothing serious, however, was apprehended from the first, and in the doctor's view, nothing serious came of it. To Jack, however, it was a very serious matter. He was detained a prisoner so long that when at length he was pronounced convalescent, he found Sykes, the conductor whose place he had taken, filling his old position again, so that the only alternative for him was to go back to the stables again at the old wage of 12 shillings a week. Jack hesitated to do this, and for some little time debated whether he should not leave Liverpool altogether. While in the hospital, he had abundant leisure to read the newspapers, and had been very much interested in an account of the construction of a new railway somewhere in Yorkshire, about 30 miles beyond Bodelford, as far as he could make out. The more he thought of this, the more pleasing the prospect became. Winter was now fairly over, and spring was always a gladsome season in the country. Moreover, he thought he would pick up his strength more quickly in the country than in the close atmosphere of a great smoky city like Liverpool. He had sufficient money to pay his fare to Bodelford, with a few shillings to spare. The remaining distance he could easily tramp, and as the way lay through Esbrig, he might, without being discovered, catch a glimpse of one dear face that was more to him than all the world besides. All things considered, he resolved to risk it. Tying up all his worldly possessions in a blue pocket handkerchief, he marched off to Lime Street Station and purchased a ticket for Bodelford. It is there that we will leave today, and we see that the two narratives are once more headed on a collision course. I doubt that any of you really believed that Jack was out of the picture forever, but it is nice to have confirmation of that fact, and interesting to know what he has been doing, and the circumstances that have led him to return to his old home, where he glimpses Ada in the crowd. I presume that is what we will see next, when we return to Real Grit by Silas Hocking on Soft Stories. Thank you so much for joining me. I so appreciate your company. And until we meet again, goodbye.